My daughter avoided me entirely after my stroke, saying she was too busy to help or visit. Yet when she needed documents signed for her business expansion, she suddenly reappeared. I agreed to meet her and listened as she spoke about loyalty and family. What she didn't know was that the document she handed me included a clause I had quietly altered with my lawyer's help. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. Before then, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you like stories like this, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time is it there. Let me take you back to where it all started. I left 3 voicemails before the nurse gently asked if there was someone else she could call. She didn't say it with judgment. She said it the way people do when they're already adjusting their expectations of you. I remember staring at the pale blue wall behind her, the 4 lines still taped to my arm, my mouth dry from medication and from the effort of pretending I wasn't humiliated. I told her there wasn't anyone else. Not really. Not anymore. My daughter's name still echoed in the room, hanging there like something unfinished, and even then I sensed that this moment, this quiet substitution of hope, was going to matter later in ways I didn't yet understand. The stroke itself had arrived without drama. No cinematic collapse, just a sudden heaviness in my arm, a slur in my words that frightened the grocery clerk more than it frightened me. What followed was a blur of sirens, fluorescent lights, and doctors speaking around me instead of to me. Through all of it, I kept thinking my daughter would show up eventually. She always had before, eventually. But hours turned into days, and the only updates she got were the ones I left in her voicemail, carefully calm, carefully reassuring, as if I were the parent and she were the fragile one who couldn't be burdened. By the 3rd day, the hospital staff had learned my routine. Physical therapy in the morning, soup I barely touched at noon, and my phone sitting face up on the tray table, silent. Every vibration that wasn't there felt louder than the machines around me. A volunteer stopped by once and asked if I had family coming. I said yes without thinking, because saying no felt like making it official. But something inside me had already begun to adjust, quietly filing this absence away as information rather than injury. Even then, a part of me knew I would need that distinction later, when clarity mattered more than comfort. When I was discharged, it wasn't my daughter who drove me home. It was my neighbor, Carol, who barely knew me beyond polite hellos and borrowed packages. She held my elbow with a care that was both awkward and sincere, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a near stranger was the one making sure I didn't fall. Carol asked if my daughter was meeting us at the house. I told her she was busy. I said it easily, like I'd practiced it. What I didn't say was that busy had become the word I used to excuse almost anything that hurt too much to name. The first night back home was harder than the hospital. There were no beeping machines to remind me I was being monitored, no staff checking in every hour. Just the familiar creaks of the house and the unsettling awareness of my own uneven breathing. I tried calling my daughter once more, this time not leaving a message. I told myself I was giving her space. I told myself recovery was my responsibility. But even as I laid those justifications neatly in place, another thought pressed through. If something happened tonight, there would be no one who noticed until it was too late. That realization didn't panic me. It steadied me, and that steadiness surprised me. Over the next few days, small things kept happening that felt insignificant on their own, but accumulated into something heavier. A birthday card from a distant cousin arrived, forwarded late, while my daughter's card never did. A text from her popped up once, brief and efficient. Hope you're feeling better. Swamped right now. I stared at it longer than I should have, reading it for tone, for hidden meaning, for any sign of urgency that might suggest she still saw me as essential. There wasn't any. I replied with a thumbs-up emoji and felt older for knowing how to minimize myself that way. Physical recovery was slow and humbling. Buttons took longer. Pens felt unfamiliar in my hand. Each minor frustration carried with it an invitation to self-pity, but I resisted it, not out of strength, but out of necessity. I needed my energy for healing. Still, in the quiet moments between exercises and naps, my mind wandered back through years of parenting decisions, wondering when exactly the balance had shifted. I wasn't rewriting history. I was inventorying it. And every inventory requires honesty, even when the numbers don't add up the way you hoped they would. A week after I came home, my lawyer's office called. Not about anything urgent, just a routine check-in on some long-standing documents we'd reviewed months earlier. At the time, the call felt like an interruption. I told them I'd follow up once I was stronger. But after I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table longer than necessary, staring at the stack of unopened mail. It occurred to me then, quietly and without drama, that there were parts of my life still functioning smoothly, still protected, even if my family connections weren't. That thought didn't comfort me. It informed me. And information, I was learning, was its own kind of leverage. 2 days later, Carol knocked on my door with a casserole and an awkward smile. She asked, gently, if my daughter had been by yet. I shook my head and felt something settle in my chest. Not resentment, not anger, but acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean approval. It means you stop waiting for evidence that contradicts what you already see. As Carol talked about her own kids, about how life pulled them in different directions, I nodded and listened, aware that I was already recalibrating my expectations. I didn't say it out loud, but a boundary was beginning to take shape in my mind, indistinct but firm. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the nurse's question from the hospital. Is there someone else she could call? At the time, it had felt like a small mercy, an attempt to spare me embarrassment. Now it felt like a warning I hadn't known how to read. Silence, I realized, wasn't just absence, it was communication. My daughter wasn't confused. She wasn't delayed. She was choosing distance, and that choice carried meaning whether she acknowledged it or not. I didn't confront her. I didn't even tell myself I would. I simply noted it, the way you note a change in the weather before deciding how to dress. By the end of that first week home, I had stopped expecting my phone to ring. In its place was something quieter but more solid, resolve. I didn't yet know what form it would take, only that this period of abandonment was not something I would later pretend hadn't happened. Recovery was teaching me patience, but it was also teaching me precision. I was paying attention now, to words, to timing, to who showed up and who didn't. And though I couldn't have articulated it then, I sensed that this silence would one day be answered, not with anger, but with intention. My phone lit up with her name for the first time in months, and my hands started shaking before I even answered. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour where the house felt suspended between day and evening, and I remember staring at the screen longer than I should have. I wasn't debating whether to pick up. I was bracing myself for the shift it would cause. When I finally answered, her voice came through bright and efficient, as if we'd spoken just yesterday. She asked how I was doing, but the question landed lightly, like something included out of courtesy rather than concern. Even then, before she said anything else, I felt a quiet certainty settle in me. This call was not about my recovery. She talked for a few minutes about work, about how hectic everything had been, about deadlines and meetings and opportunities she couldn't afford to miss. I listened, murmuring where appropriate, noting how practiced she sounded. It wasn't that she was lying. She was busy. What struck me was how seamlessly her busyness had accommodated everything except me. When she finally paused, there was a beat of silence, just long enough for me to wonder if she was waiting for reassurance or permission. Instead, she said she needed a favor. The word landed heavily, because favors imply balance, and I suddenly couldn't remember the last time she'd done one for me. After we hung up, I sat there with the phone still in my hand, staring at the darkened screen as if it might explain something if I waited long enough. I didn't feel angry. I felt alert. There's a difference, and I recognized it immediately. Anger blurs your vision. Alertness sharpens it. I replayed the call in my mind, not obsessively, but carefully, the way you examine something fragile to see where it might crack. She hadn't asked about my physical therapy. She hadn't mentioned the hospital. She'd moved directly from pleasantries to need, and that efficiency told me more than any apology ever could. That evening, as I sorted through mail, I found myself paying closer attention to dates. Bills I'd paid automatically for years. Notices I'd skimmed without reading. Time, I realized, was suddenly something I needed to account for differently. I checked my calendar and saw the long stretch of blank days since my stroke, unmarked by visits or calls. Then I checked my email, where a forwarded message from my daughter sat unopened, something she'd sent by accident, she later claimed. It outlined a tentative timeline for a business expansion, ambitious and fast-moving. She had been planning this for months. She just hadn't planned me into it. 2 days later, she texted again, asking if we could meet in person. She framed it as wanting to catch up, but she suggested a cafe near her office, not my house, not anywhere that accounted for my limited stamina. I agreed anyway, and the moment I sent that message, I felt something shift internally. Agreeing wasn't capitulation, it was strategy. I didn't tell myself that explicitly, but I felt it in the way my breathing steadied afterward. Whatever she wanted, I would hear it fully before responding. I had learned enough during recovery to know that rushing emotional decisions only benefited the person least affected by them. The day before our meeting, my friend Linda stopped by unannounced. She took one look at my face and asked who had finally called. I told her, and she didn't interrupt, just listened, her expression tightening in a way that mirrored my own unspoken thoughts. When I finished, she said, "Be careful." Not dramatically, not accusingly. Just carefully, like someone pointing out a step you might miss if you weren't watching your footing. That warning stayed with me, not because it was new, but because it validated something I hadn't yet put into words. That night, I couldn't sleep, not from anxiety, but from mental activity. I kept thinking about the way my daughter had spoken about loyalty in the past, usually when she needed something reinforced. Loyalty, in her vocabulary, often meant alignment. Being on her side, supporting her direction, trusting her judgment. Family, too, had become a flexible term, invoked selectively. As I lay there, listening to the house settle, I realized I had spent years equating flexibility with love, bending to accommodate her growth, her independence, her mistakes. What I hadn't considered was what happened when flexibility went unreciprocated. The morning of the meeting, my hand trembled slightly as I buttoned my coat. It wasn't fear. It was residual weakness, a reminder that my body was still catching up to my mind. I took that as a sign to move slowly, deliberately. At the cafe, I arrived early and chose a seat where I could observe without being observed too closely. When she walked in, she looked exactly as she always had, confident, distracted, already scanning the room for outlets and opportunities. She hugged me briefly, perfunctorily, and launched into conversation before we even sat down. As she talked, I noticed how often she checked her phone, how her sentences curved back toward herself. She mentioned family once, abstractly, as a foundation, as something that grounded her ambitions. I nodded, listening, feeling an unexpected calm wash over me. This was who she was right now. Not malicious, not cruel, just oriented elsewhere. And for the first time since my stroke, I allowed myself to fully accept that orientation without trying to correct it. Acceptance, I was learning, wasn't surrender. It was clarity. When she finally mentioned the documents, she did it casually, as if they were an afterthought, something to streamline things, something I wouldn't mind helping with, since we were family. I asked a few neutral questions, nothing confrontational, and she answered easily, confidently. As she spoke, I became acutely aware of how much she assumed my trust, my compliance, my continued availability as a safety net. That assumption didn't offend me. It informed me. And even as I listened, I knew this conversation would not end the way she expected it to, though she wouldn't realize that for some time. By the time we stood to leave, she seemed satisfied, even relieved. She thanked me, promised to check in more often, and disappeared back into her schedule. I watched her go, feeling neither victorious nor defeated, just resolved. I hadn't confronted her. I hadn't corrected her narrative. I hadn't even told her yes or no. What I had done was gather information, and information has weight. As I walked home slowly, carefully, I understood something with surprising clarity. This meeting was not the turning point. It was the confirmation. And from that confirmation forward, every decision I made would be quieter, firmer, and far more intentional than anything I'd done before. She slid the folder across the table before the coffee arrived. The motion was smooth, practiced, like she'd rehearsed it in her head and finally reached the part where the prop came out. The folder landed between us with a soft thud, not aggressive, not hesitant, confident. I remember noticing the way her nails were done, how deliberate everything about her presentation felt, and how unprepared she seemed for the possibility that I might not mirror her energy. I didn't open it right away. I rested my hand beside it, letting the moment stretch just long enough to register. Even then, I had the distinct sense that whatever happened next would settle something permanently, even if neither of us said it out loud. She began talking before I touched the folder, filling the space with language that sounded warm but felt curated. She spoke about loyalty as if it were a shared inheritance, something passed down rather than practiced. Family, she said, was the reason she worked so hard, the reason she wanted to build something lasting. I listened without interrupting, noting how seamlessly she folded me into her narrative without actually including me in her life. Within those first few minutes, I felt the early outline of a consequence forming in my mind. Not revenge, not refusal, but a correction that would arrive later, quietly, when she least expected it. When I finally opened the folder, I did it slowly, carefully, aware of how my hands still betrayed me when I rushed. The pages were neatly arranged, flagged where signatures were needed, highlighted in places she clearly wanted me to notice. She leaned back as I read, confident enough to give me space, already certain of the outcome. I felt an odd detachment settle over me as I scanned the language. It wasn't that I didn't understand it, it was that I understood it too well. Years ago, I might have skimmed, trusting her intentions over the details. Now, the details felt like the only honest part of the exchange. A waiter interrupted to take our order, and the pause felt like a reset. She ordered quickly, decisively, then glanced at her phone while I spoke to the waiter more slowly, carefully. That small interruption grounded me in my body again, reminded me where I was and who I was becoming. When the waiter left, she resumed her explanation, clarifying points I hadn't asked about, reassuring me about safeguards I hadn't questioned. Each reassurance landed as evidence of assumption rather than care. I nodded, made a few noncommittal sounds, and let her continue. I wasn't there to debate. I was there to observe. As she talked, I became acutely aware of how often she framed her needs as collective benefits. This helps all of us. This protects the family. This is what you would want. Each phrase was delivered gently, reasonably, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. She wasn't asking for my trust, she was presuming it. And in that presumption, I saw clearly how my vulnerability had been factored in not as something to protect, but as something to leverage. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful. I knew, even then, that I would not challenge her in that moment, and that decision, to wait, would shape everything that followed. Halfway through the meeting, my phone buzzed with a notification from my physical therapist, confirming an appointment I'd almost forgotten. The mundane interruption felt strangely stabilizing, a reminder that my life still had rhythms outside of her agenda. I silenced the phone and met her eyes again, noticing for the first time a flicker of impatience beneath her composure. She wanted resolution. She wanted closure. I gave her neither. Instead, I asked a single, neutral question about timing, phrased carefully enough to sound supportive. She answered easily, unaware that she was revealing more than she intended to. When the coffee finally arrived, she took a sip and smiled, as if the hardest part was over. I realized then that she believed the meeting itself was the effort, the gesture that fulfilled her obligation. Signing, in her mind, was a formality. That assumption settled something in me. I didn't correct her. I didn't remind her where she hadn't been, or how long it had taken her to call. I simply returned my attention to the document, feeling the weight of the pen in my hand. The physical act of holding it reminded me of my limitations and my agency. Both mattered. I signed where she indicated, my handwriting slightly slower than it used to be, but steady. She watched closely, relief softening her features with each completed page. I didn't rush. I didn't explain. I didn't say anything that would alert her to the care with which this moment had been prepared. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know yet, was that the document in front of me was not the one she thought it was. The difference was subtle, technical, and entirely intentional. And as I signed, I felt no triumph, only a quiet alignment with the version of myself that recovery had been shaping. We stood to leave shortly after, the conversation already drifting toward her next commitment. She hugged me again, this time with a touch more warmth, and thanked me for being there. I nodded, accepting the words without absorbing them. Outside, the air felt cooler, sharper. I walked home slowly, aware of the strain in my legs and the steadiness in my mind. I hadn't confronted her. I hadn't refused her. I had done something far more consequential. And though she walked away believing everything was settled, I knew the truth would surface later, carried by delays and questions she wouldn't be able to smooth over. I didn't confront her that day, and that delay, I already sensed, would cost her far more than an argument ever could. 2 weeks later, she posted a photo with the caption, "Big things coming." I saw it while eating breakfast, the toast cooling beside me as I stared at the screen longer than necessary. She was smiling in the photo, standing in front of what looked like a rented office space, keys dangling from her fingers like a symbol she hadn't earned yet. The image itself wasn't what unsettled me. It was the confidence behind it, the certainty that everything was already secured. I set the phone face down and finished my coffee slowly, aware that the consequences of our meeting had begun moving, quietly and irreversibly, even if she hadn't noticed yet. In the days that followed, I settled into a routine that looked calm from the outside. Physical therapy appointments marked my mornings. Short walks filled my afternoons. Evenings were quiet, measured, deliberate. Internally, though, I was alert in a way I hadn't been before, attuned to small shifts and subtle signals. I wasn't waiting for her to fail. I was waiting for the structure she assumed was solid to reveal its seams. That distinction mattered to me. I didn't want collapse. I wanted pause. A pause would force reflection, and reflection was the one thing she had been avoiding. A few days after that post, I received a voicemail from my lawyer, brief and procedural. He confirmed that everything had been filed correctly and that any changes would surface only when action was attempted. The call lasted less than a minute, but I sat with the phone in my hand long after it ended. There was no thrill in hearing his calm assurance. What I felt instead was steadiness. Preparation, I realized, didn't create drama, it absorbed it. Whatever came next would unfold without my intervention, and that was exactly how I wanted it. She didn't call me during that time. Not to check in, not to update me. I noticed the absence without reacting to it, the way you notice weather patterns once you stop believing you can control them. Instead, messages arrived indirectly. An email she forwarded accidentally, asking me if I recognized the sender. A text meant for someone else, referencing delays she didn't yet understand. Each one was a small window into her growing confusion, though she still framed it as inconvenience rather than obstacle. I didn't respond beyond what was necessary. Silence, I was learning, could be both shield and mirror. By that weekend, my body felt stronger than it had in months. I walked farther without needing to rest. My grip steadied. Recovery was no longer just happening to me. I was participating in it. That physical progress mirrored something internal I hadn't fully acknowledged yet. I was no longer reacting to my daughter's choices. I was responding to my own needs. That shift didn't come with fanfare. It came with quiet decisions, like choosing not to explain myself when no explanation was owed. I knew then that whatever happened next would test that resolve. On Monday morning, I received a message from her that sounded almost casual. She mentioned a minor hiccup, asked if I'd heard anything unusual, joked about bureaucracy being slow. I replied politely, briefly, telling her I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. That wasn't a lie. The out of the ordinary was unfolding exactly as designed. As I sent the message, I felt a twinge of something like sadness. Not for the inconvenience she was facing, but for the fact that she still believed this was a shared problem rather than a consequence of assumptions she'd never examined. Later that week, Linda stopped by again, bringing soup and her unfiltered observations. She mentioned seeing my daughter's post, asked how things were going. I told her the truth, carefully framed, that things were moving, that patience was required. Linda studied me for a long moment before nodding, as if recognizing something new in my posture, my tone. "You seem steadier," she said. I smiled at that, because steadiness was exactly what I felt. Not hardened, not detached, just no longer swaying in response to someone else's urgency. As days passed, more signs appeared. A stalled payment notice my daughter forwarded without context, asking if I thought it was normal. A brief, clipped voicemail where she sounded tired, irritated, but still not worried. Each interruption reset my attention without pulling me off course. I listened. I observed. I didn't advise. There was a temptation, at times, to step in, to smooth things over the way I always had. But I reminded myself that smoothing things over was how we'd arrived here. Growth required friction. Boundaries required patience. By the end of the second week, her tone shifted. The confidence softened into concern, though she still hadn't connected it to me. She spoke about unexpected oversight and new requirements, phrases that frustrated her because they resisted her usual momentum. I could hear the strain in her voice when she finally called, the way certainty had given way to irritation. Still, she didn't ask directly. She circled the issue, hoping I would fill in the gaps for her. I didn't. That restraint felt like the final step in a process I'd begun months earlier, in a hospital room where silence first taught me how to listen. One evening, as I sat alone watching the light fade from the living room, I thought about how differently this would have unfolded if I'd confronted her earlier. There would have been arguments, accusations, emotional exhaustion. Instead, there was space. Space for her actions to meet reality without my interference. Space for me to recover without defending my worth. I knew then that when the truth finally surfaced, and it wouldn't come from my mouth. It would come from the document she hadn't read closely enough, the structure she'd trusted without understanding. And when that moment arrived, it would change everything between us, whether she admitted it or not. She called, not to ask how I was, but to ask why nothing was moving. Her voice came through tight, clipped, the confidence I'd heard so often replaced by something brittle. There was no greeting, no small talk, no concern layered in out of habit. Just frustration, sharpened by confusion. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone on speaker, a glass of water untouched beside me, and listened without interrupting. Even before she finished her first sentence, I knew this was the moment everything shifted. Not the end, not the reckoning, but the point where the truth began asserting itself without my help. She spoke quickly, listing obstacles she didn't understand, approvals that hadn't come through, timelines that suddenly felt unrealistic. She asked if I'd received any notices, if anyone had contacted me, if I knew what was causing the delay. I answered calmly, truthfully, telling her I hadn't been contacted directly. That was enough to unbalance her. Silence followed, brief, but telling. I could almost hear her recalibrating, searching for the lever that usually made things move. Within that pause, I felt the early outline of an irreversible change forming. Not because I intended to draw a line that day, but because she was approaching one whether she liked it or not. As she resumed speaking, her tone softened artificially, slipping into something more familiar. She reminded me of how important this expansion was, how much she'd invested, how much pressure she was under. Family was mentioned again, this time as a reassurance rather than a principle. I listened, feeling the weight of the past weeks settle into clarity. The document had begun to do its work, and already it was speaking more honestly than either of us had. I didn't rush to explain. I asked one neutral question, carefully chosen, about whether she'd reviewed the oversight provisions recently. There was another pause, longer this time. She said she didn't think that was the issue. Oversight was standard, she insisted, just a formality. I let her words hang there, resisting the urge to correct her immediately. Instead, I suggested she loop in her attorney, check the filings, make sure everything aligned. The suggestion sounded supportive, even helpful, and that was intentional. I wasn't there to corner her. I was there to let reality arrive intact. When she agreed reluctantly, I knew the clock had started ticking in earnest. 2 days later, I received an email from her attorney, polite and precise, asking for clarification on a specific clause. I forwarded it to my lawyer without comment. The exchange that followed happened entirely without me, professional to professional, stripped of emotion and assumption. That distance mattered. It ensured that what emerged would be framed not as a personal dispute, but as a structural reality. When my lawyer called to confirm that the explanation had been delivered clearly, I thanked him and ended the call quickly. I didn't need reassurance. I needed patience. That evening, my daughter called again. This time, her voice was quieter, edged with disbelief rather than irritation. She asked me directly what the clause meant, why a third-party trustee had authority, how this had happened. I explained calmly, using the same measured tone I'd practiced during my recovery. I told her the change had been discussed months earlier, that it was designed to protect all involved, that it ensured oversight during periods of vulnerability. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't mention the hospital, the unanswered calls, the months of absence. The facts were enough. She accused me then, softly at first, of not trusting her. I acknowledged that trust had been a factor, without elaborating. She asked why I hadn't told her sooner. I told her I'd assumed she'd read the document carefully. That answer landed harder than any accusation could have. There was no defense against it. Documents don't care about intentions. They only reflect preparation. As the silence stretched between us, I felt a familiar ache rise. Grief, not guilt. Grief for the daughter I'd hoped would notice me without needing leverage. A notification interrupted the call. An email chimed through on my computer. She heard it and asked what it was. I told her, truthfully, that it was a confirmation of my next physical therapy milestone. That detail shifted something subtle but important. It reminded her, perhaps for the first time in weeks, that my life had continued beyond her plans, that my recovery hadn't paused for her convenience. She didn't respond immediately, and when she did, her voice had lost its edge. Confusion had given way to something closer to realization. She said she felt blindsided. I told her I understood that feeling more than she might think. The words weren't a jab, they were an offering. Whether she accepted them wasn't my concern. I didn't explain further. I didn't justify. I let the conversation end naturally, without resolution, without comfort. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet, noticing how steady my hands felt. This was the first time I'd spoken plainly to her without trying to manage her reaction. The absence of that effort felt like relief. Over the next week, the fallout continued at a distance. Messages from her became sporadic, cautious. She asked procedural questions, not personal ones. The trustee arrangement slowed everything, exactly as intended, not to punish, but to force deliberation. I watched from the outside, resisting the urge to intervene. Each delay was a mirror, reflecting the cost of moving fast without looking back. I didn't take pleasure in it. I took responsibility for allowing it to stand. There's a difference, and I was finally living inside it. By the end of that week, I understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever happened next would redefine our relationship permanently. Not because of the clause, or the business, or the delay, but because I had chosen protection over appeasement, clarity over comfort. That choice had already been made. The only thing left was to decide how much access she would have to me going forward. I didn't decide that yet. I didn't need to. The boundary was forming on its own, shaped by silence, structure, and the long overdue realization that love without limits isn't loyalty, it's erasure. She accused me of betrayal, and in that moment I realized she had never once apologized for leaving me alone. The accusation came not as a shout, but as a strained sentence delivered with the kind of disbelief that expects correction. We were on the phone again, days after the last call, and I could hear how tightly she was holding herself together. Betrayal, she said, was what it felt like. I didn't respond immediately. I let the words sit between us, heavy and unchallenged, because I needed to understand it fully before I answered. Even then, within the first few moments of that call, I knew a final boundary was about to be set, one that wouldn't be negotiated later. She spoke at length, retracing events with a version of history that centered her shock rather than my absence. She talked about trust as if it were a one-way street, about how hurt she was, about how she never imagined I would do something like this. I listened the way I had learned to listen during recovery, not defensively, not eagerly, but attentively. As she spoke, a quiet inventory formed in my mind, not of her failures, but of the moments I'd waited for that never came. Hospital days, missed calls, the silence that followed my discharge. I didn't interrupt her to list them. I didn't need to. They were no longer grievances. They were context. When she finally paused, waiting for my defense, I spoke calmly. I told her I hadn't betrayed her. I told her I had protected myself. The distinction mattered, and I let it stand without elaboration. I explained that vulnerability had clarified things for me, that the stroke had forced me to see who showed up and who didn't. My voice didn't shake. I didn't raise it. I wasn't trying to win. I was naming something true. Within the first minute of that explanation, I sensed that whatever reaction followed would not change the decision already forming in me. This wasn't a conversation about reconciliation. It was a conversation about limits. She pushed back, saying she'd been overwhelmed, that she hadn't known how serious things were. I acknowledged that. I told her I understood overwhelm. I told her I'd lived inside it while relearning how to button my coat and walk across my living room without support. The comparison wasn't meant to shame her. It was meant to ground us both in reality. Reality doesn't bend to intention. It responds to action. As I spoke, I felt an unexpected calm settle in. This was not the explosive confrontation I'd once feared. It was quieter, firmer, and far more final. A message notification interrupted us, an automated notice confirming the trustees' next review meeting. I mentioned it offhandedly, not as a threat, but as a fact. She went silent again, and in that silence I recognized something important. She was finally understanding that this structure existed independently of our emotions, that I could no longer be persuaded, rushed, or guilted into reversing it. I told her then, clearly and without apology, that the arrangement would remain in place, that my assets would be managed with oversight, that access would be limited, not forever, necessarily, but until trust was demonstrated through presence, not words. She asked what that meant for us. The question was quieter now, stripped of accusation. I answered honestly. I told her it meant I would no longer explain my boundaries in advance, that I would no longer fill in gaps created by her absence, that if she wanted to be part of my life, she would need to show up consistently, without agenda. I didn't threaten to cut her off completely. I didn't dramatize the moment. I simply described the conditions under which I would continue. Those conditions were not punishments. They were protections. And I could feel, even as I spoke them, how much lighter I felt for finally articulating them. The call ended without resolution. No apology. No agreement. Just an uneasy quiet that followed her goodbye. I set the phone down and sat there, noticing how my body responded. No racing heart. No shaking hands. Just a deep, steady breath. I realized then that I had crossed a line internally, one I couldn't uncross even if I wanted to. I had stopped managing her reactions. I had stopped minimizing my needs. That shift didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel intact. And that, more than anything, told me the boundary was real. In the days that followed, I formalized what I'd already said. A written notice went out, confirming the trustee arrangement and clarifying communication channels. It wasn't cold or punitive. It was clear. Clarity, I'd learned, is often mistaken for cruelty by those who benefit from ambiguity. I didn't explain myself further. I didn't soften the language. I trusted the structure I'd put in place. When my daughter sent a brief message expressing disappointment, I acknowledged it without reopening the conversation. That restraint was the final piece. The boundary held because I held it. Physically, I reached a milestone that same week, my first full walk without a cane. I did it alone, around the block, feeling the weight of each step and the strength returning to my legs. The timing felt symbolic, though I didn't dwell on it. Recovery had given me back more than mobility. It had given me discernment. I no longer confused endurance with obligation. I no longer equated love with access. Standing at the corner before turning back home, I felt a quiet pride, not in what I'd taken away, but in what I'd preserved. There were moments of grief, of course. Letting go of the fantasy of mutual care hurts, even when it's necessary. I allowed myself that grief without letting it rewrite my decisions. I reminded myself that boundaries don't erase love, they define its limits. And sometimes, those limits are the only thing that keeps love from becoming self-betrayal. I didn't know what our relationship would look like in the future. I still don't. But I knew what it would not look like anymore. And that certainty brought peace. Looking back now, I understand that I never needed to raise my voice to protect myself. I needed patience, preparation, and the courage to let consequences speak where arguments never could. The document did its work. The silence did its work. And I finally did mine. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been pushed too far, overlooked when you needed support most, or learned that quiet strength can be stronger than confrontation, then you're not alone. Please like this video if it spoke to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more real stories about boundaries, self-respect, and choosing dignity when no one is watching. Sometimes, those quiet choices change everything. See you soon in the next story.